Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss Boris Johnson's apparent attempts to speed up his plans to control the judiciary and remove more power from Parliament while he's at it. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, what do we call it when a head of government removes the power of the other two branches of government in order to avoid checks and balances against their power? I'll leave you to answer that one. So it was pretty clear from reading the Conservative Party manifesto, specifically the infamous page 48, I think it was, that Boris Johnson intended to centralise power and bypass Parliament, as well as clipping the wings of the judiciary. But he claimed that he would set up a commission in order to come up with recommendations for this process. Now, obviously, the commission would find whatever he wanted to, I imagine, but it would have taken a little bit of time. But according to the Telegraph, which is the right-wing paper that used to pay Boris Johnson a hefty sum to write for them, he has scrapped his manifesto pledge in favour of just doing it the way he wants to do it. I mean, I say doing it the way he wants to do it. I presume it's actually the way Dominic Cummings wants to do it, as he drives everything else in government. Now, Boris Johnson has said that he wants to define what a court can and cannot challenge when it comes to government actions. This essentially means he wants the government to be above the law in certain areas because, of course, all courts ever do is decide on matters of law. So Boris Johnson is trying to claim that they make political decisions. They do not. This is why the courts were not able to invalidate the Brexit referendum, for example, despite the fact that the Leave campaigns broke the law. This is because the referendum was not the legal reason we were leaving the EU, so it wasn't for a judge to act. But it is why the Supreme Court ordered Theresa May to get parliamentary approval before triggering Article 50, because it's Parliament that decides on those matters. It is also why Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament last year was ruled unlawful, again, because it was done specifically to bypass Parliament. In both cases that upset some Brexiteers, the court upheld the authority of Parliament over the executive. That Boris Johnson wants to change this has nothing to do with the courts as such, and entirely about Parliament. He wants to stop Parliament being able to exercise its authority over him. And why would he do this, you may ask? And it is a good question, because after all, Parliament has gone along with his Brexit madness. You know, they are also granting him emergency powers that he's using to do as he pleases, using COVID as cover. They're even letting him carry out his trade talks completely behind closed doors with zero scrutiny from Parliament whatsoever. Parliament has already voted under Johnson on at least 2 occasions to remove their own power and defer to the government. So why would Boris Johnson be rushing this plan through now? Now, I'm going to emphasise here, so I have read a few things that legal and constitutional experts have said. Most of what I'm going through here is my own reading of it at the moment, and this absolutely definitely has not been informed by experts. But that's the question that runs through my mind. Why is Boris Johnson hastening the process when he's getting Parliament to do everything that he wants right now? Apart from a few minor things, you know, like not letting kids starve over summer. And it can only mean, surely, correct me if I'm wrong, that he expects Parliament at some point in the foreseeable future to want to block him over something very serious. He expects a showdown. Now, I don't know whether he expects a showdown over his handling of COVID or the consequences of the no-deal Brexit next year, that of course his MPs voted for, or even if it's of something else that we do not yet know about. What I do know is that you do not accelerate your plans for something unless there's some good reason to suppose that the originally intended timetable is not going to be quick enough. So Suella Braverman, who is the Attorney General appointed by Boris Johnson specifically to take a hatchet to our courts, tried to say that the aforementioned court decisions supplanted Parliament. Yet not only did she support the government's actual supplanting of Parliament last year, but she will know perfectly well that both cases essentially had the Supreme Court say, you can do this thing if Parliament is in agreement. There was nothing else in their judgment. They didn't say, for example, that Theresa May couldn't trigger Article 50. What they said was, you have to ask Parliament first. They also didn't say Parliament can't be prorogued. I mean, it is on a relatively regular basis. What they said was that you cannot do it for the purpose of stopping Parliament carrying out its wishes. In both cases, the judgments were enforcing parliamentary sovereignty. And an attack on this process is an attack on our Parliament. And remember that of the three branches of government, the executive, which is Boris Johnson's government, the legislature, which is Parliament, and the judiciary, which are the courts, only Parliament of any of those branches of government is democratically elected. The government aren't. People will say, oh, Boris Johnson's democratically elected. Not as Prime Minister, he's not. He's elected as an MP, not as Prime Minister. The government, none of the government ministers are appointed to their positions as a result of any democratic process. In fact, not all members of the government are even MPs. They're not even all elected to something. I mean, it is usual to have one or two from the House of Lords. Obviously, the leader of the House of Lords has to be in the Lords, and they're not democratically elected. Although, I mean, it would be useful if they were. But Boris Johnson has more unelected members in his cabinet than previous prime ministers in modern political history. So to remove the power from our Parliament is also an attack on our democratic representation, because only Parliament has any democratic representation for us in this matter. We also saw this behaviour in the very late appointment of the Security and Intelligence Committee that last week released the Russian report. Boris Johnson prevented its formation for over half a year. And when he did finally let it form, after 8 months of zero parliamentary scrutiny over our security agencies, he attempted to rig it with his nomination of Chris Grayling as chair. Fortunately, there is absolutely nothing that Chris Grayling cannot make a mess of, even losing a vote that was rigged in his favour. So we have had the report published now, but it took much longer than it should have done, and there are many other reports still being suppressed because Johnson still does have generally very good control over Parliament, and that also means the key parliamentary committees. We should also remember that Boris Johnson's government have brought out half a dozen times now new laws in relation to the coronavirus pandemic. New laws that create new criminal acts, and all of it without going through Parliament. All of it. The first time may have been understandable. Emergency situation. Yes, it was a more serious emergency because the government took so long to act, but it was an emergency situation. But there have been plenty of times since to get the scrutiny of MPs in each subsequent time. So every time there's been new regulations brought out, they haven't been as a result of an emergency. They've actually been scaling back the measures, so there has been time. Some of the measures were even announced weeks in advance, so there was definitely time for it to go through Parliament. That Johnson failed to do so is not because of the emergency. The emergency here is that he is making up laws and new criminal acts that is supposed to be for Parliament. That's why Parliament is called the legislature. It's supposed to legislate, not the government. Finally, and this did come from an expert legal commentator, it wasn't at the forefront of my own mind. I hadn't considered this. It was noted that in drafting the various Brexit bills, there's an awful lot of legislation going on for Brexit. I've been talking about quite a lot of them. A lot of them have the scope for ministers to fill in the details later. They have been described as skeleton bills that give approval for very vague powers that ministers can use for very, very unintended purposes later on. It's basically like presenting a blank piece of paper to Parliament saying, sign this, will you? I'll fill in the contract later. That is effectively what's been happening. And if all of this goes through, it means that Parliament will just be a show Parliament. It will have no choice but to tamely nod along with everything Boris Johnson does. And if it tries to stop him, as it did last year, he can pull the plug on them, as he did last year, but this time no court will have the authority to tell him he doesn't have the power. The only thing that could stop him then is the Conservative Party itself, which has got nothing to do with Parliament as such. The Conservative Party could, of course, remove Johnson, but then those powers would still be in place for his successor, the next one to occupy the throne that Johnson and Cummings have created. So, are we doomed in all of this? Not necessarily. Now, this is my own take. I've not got this from any legal experts. I'm not a legal or constitutional expert. I do follow a number, and I'm sure many of them will be commenting more as this process continues as well. But there are three things to consider from my point of view. First of all, it does still rely upon almost all Conservative MPs being dumb enough to go along with this. It's not in the interests of any party's MPs to support this, but it surely couldn't possibly get any support outside of the Conservative Party. So, all there would need to be is a few dozen Tory MPs with any sense at all to block this. Am I confident in that? No, but it is possible. Secondly, messing about with the nature of courts is a tricky process in the UK. It may well be that Boris Johnson is forgetting, for example, that Scotland has its own system of courts, and they would be empowered. The Court of Session would absolutely be empowered to judge, and is empowered to judge, on a matter pertaining to the whole UK. So if Boris Johnson wants to do this, well, I mean, we saw the effectiveness of the Scottish Court of Session during his antics last autumn. Third, the House of Lords surely will not be in favour of this madness. Now, they cannot block such plans indefinitely, but they could take a stand and slow it all down. Generally speaking, when the government is determined on something, the Lords queries it, but usually goes along with it. This could be so serious that they could actually just stop it, and it would have to wait for another session of Parliament before it could be forced through the Lords. So there are some possibilities still. It's not all hopeless, but it is still very, very worrying nonetheless. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.